chatting.
Do you want us to be kind of in standby mode here while you get started? I assume
Yeah,
yes. Okay.
yeah, that will work great. And
Okay. I'm going to disappear then.
okay.
Okay.
Well, great. Looks like we have a few folks joining us already. Thanks for being here. We'll get started in just a second. I like to leave just a couple minutes at the beginning to let folks join. So we'll get started in just a second. And if you do have need for closed captions, we do have captioning turned on. So you can click that closed captions button at the bottom of your screen. And like I said, we'll get started in just a minute here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started just so that we can get the conversation going. I'm really eager to hear from tonight's panelists. So thank you everyone for joining us. My name is AC. I work with the Oklahoma Humanities on this Citizen 2020 project. We're really excited for you to join us tonight for a conversation about media literacy. Citizen 2020 is an Oklahoma specific program, but is one component of a much larger national initiative called Democracy and the Informed Citizen. And it's actually being run by humanities councils in 46 states, Guam, and the Marianas Islands, all participating in this collaborative project and conversation administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils with funds from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. So we're very grateful to them for their contribution to this work. And we're excited for this last installment of our programming. So I really am not going to talk too much longer. I'm going to turn it over to Yvette Walker and Dick Pryor, and they're going to lead you in a really interesting conversation, like I said, about media literacy and the importance of media literacy as we make some important decisions coming up in the 2020 election. So I'm going to fade into the background a little bit, but if you're watching and you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box or submit them through the Q&A function. And if you need closed captioning, we do have closed captioning turned on. So you can press the button at the bottom of your screen marked CC, and you can turn on the closed captioning there. Thanks for joining us, y'all.
Thank you, AC. Sorry about that. I had a cough there. Hope that does not come back. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our conversation around media literacy in news and information. I'm Yvette Walker, Assistant Dean of Student Affairs at the Gaylord College of Journalism and Mass Communication, where I teach media ethics, media literacy, and journalism ethics. And our guest tonight is Dick Pryor, and he'll introduce himself.
Thanks very much, Yvette. Hi, I'm Dick Pryor, and I'm a graduate of the University of Oklahoma, Norman High School first, and University of Oklahoma with a degree in radio, TV journalism, and law. I started my career at KGOU Radio as a freshman at the University of Oklahoma, and now I'm the general manager. And next month, I'll celebrate my 4th year as general manager at KGOU, your NPR source. A little bit of background on me. I started in radio and did sports, actually, in radio and television for the first 15 years of my career. And then after that, with stints in Wichita Falls, Tulsa, at Channel 2 in Tulsa, Channel 3 in Wichita Falls, and Channel 5 at KOCO in Oklahoma City, I wound up going to OETA, and that's when I went to law school and graduated in '93 from law school. But I did anchoring, hosting, was news director, managing editor, and various other things at OETA for 25 years. And after leaving there, I surfaced again in broadcasting at KGOU. And that's what pretty much what I've done. I've also worked in public relations for Oklahoma City's AAA baseball team and was chief of staff for the lieutenant governor of Oklahoma for a while. So I've got government service, law, practice law too. Can't hold a job, I suppose, is what some people say. But I've had a fairly varied experience, and I'm glad for it.
Well, thank you so much, Dick. I know we're going to have a great conversation tonight. I know media literacy is important to both of us. I've worked for newspapers most of my career. I was an ombudsman at the Kansas City Star, where we talked a lot about media literacy, although we weren't really calling it that back then. And before coming to OU, I was the night news director at the Oklahoman. So I think we'll have a good conversation, and I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
So I'd like to open our conversation around media literacy right here in our state. So media literacy is defined by the National Association of Media Literacy Education as the ability to access, to analyze, to evaluate, to create, and to act using all forms of communication. So just kind of getting a benchmark definition there. Dick, what are the biggest challenges Oklahomans face around media literacy?
Well, obviously, I think the members of the media need to do a better job explaining what we do.
Mm-hmm.
Media literacy really can begin with us, and I don't think we do a very good job of explaining what our role is. But basically, the people that we serve, that is news consumers, that is our listeners, our readers, and people that watch us on television, I don't think they understand what the public's role is and what the media's role is in citizenship. I don't think they understand our methods. I don't think they understand the demands on us, that's editorially and financially, the limitations that we have imposed upon us, which often is because of our ethics. And then also, I don't know that people really understand civics much anymore. A lot of people, especially those that are older in our audience, understand civics, but civics and other relevant subject matter topics, I don't know that people are really that well versed in it. It's a rapidly changing world we live in, and to be an educated citizen, including educated about the news media, you really have to work at it. And I think also one other thing I would say is that sometimes it's just too easy. And so people want to consume news and information as easily as possible, when they can get it, how they can get it, and they don't really practice true intellectual curiosity or practice critical thinking skills. And so my appeal to members of the public who want to know more about media literacy is to get more engaged, read more, listen more, and consume diverse media, and then talk about it, think about it, and work on learning more about it.
Mm. So that's quite a few challenges there. And I'm wondering how much of a responsibility we have, since we know that those challenges exist. So historically, or even now, since we know those challenges exist, I guess, what's our responsibility and what do we have to do? We can say that our news consumers, they're not taking civics in school. Do they even teach civics in school anymore? Do we have to make up for that, or do we have to put some burden on the news consumer itself?
Well, I think it's a combination. I think we have to remain committed to what we're supposed to do, and that is to seek the truth. We're supposed to do a lot of things as members of the news media, including holding elected officials and powerful institutions accountable, connecting other people with information that helps us talk to each other. So we've got to do a better job, I think, of focusing on those issues and those stories and working on our craft to tell stories well so that people will listen, so that people will have a takeaway and they can learn. I come up from a family of educators. My mother was a teacher. My wife was a teacher. My grandparents were teachers. And I really firmly believe that those of us in journalism are also teachers. And so I think we have an educational component to what we do. But I also believe that we need to let people know, and everyone needs to understand, that capacity, especially in a state like Oklahoma, with not that many people, and overall a reasonably poor state, with some exceptions, but a reasonably poor state, capacity is a challenge for us. And when I say capacity, I mean funding and staffing.
Mhm.
We don't have unlimited staff. We don't have unlimited money. We're not like a big market station, perhaps, where you're in San Francisco or New York or Boston or Chicago or Dallas even, where you have more resources. Oklahoma, I believe, is a target-rich state for storytelling. We're able to sell young journalists sometimes on coming to Oklahoma because there's so many great stories you can tell in Oklahoma. But also we are capped because we can't cover everything and we can't pay as well as some other states. I think it's important for people to know that journalism, good journalism, takes time, skill, and commitment, and good journalism is not free.
Mm. That is so true. So I always tell my students this: the way we access our information may change, but there will always be a need for news and information. And so you mentioned, for example, immediate consumption and people not taking the time to really dig into a story, right?
Mhm.
So the changes we've had certainly now certainly rely and circle around technology and the improvements that we've seen over the years in technology. And that's certainly where a lot of younger people, they're using technology to get their news and information. If there is immediate gratification, immediate consumption, what can we tell them to do beyond just reading it on their social media feed or scanning?
I think it's important for people to learn that they need to ask questions. That's what we do.
Mhm.
I will tell anybody that wants to listen that I think the best degree to have, and I'm a lawyer too, but the best degree to have is a journalism degree
Mm.
because we learn how to ask questions. We learn how to write. We learn how to speak. We learn how to think critically about issues that really matter. And as long as we in journalism focus on those issues that really matter to people, then I think we're doing the right thing. But I think it's really tough because news consumers are impatient. There are so many sources now, and Yvette, you know this, so many ways you can get information. Some of it is reliable, some of it is just stuff.
Mhm.
And I think it's important for us to know the difference. And, you know, we sometimes talk about the 24-hour news cycle and how that has changed our news consumption. Remember, though, it's not really a 24-hour news cycle. It's 24 hours of stuff. And some of it is news, some of it is repeated. It's not continually updated news.
Mhm.
It's often, recorded in advance or it's recycled. And remember too that those networks, those channels that do that, they have to put something on. And sometimes it's not the greatest. And it often means talking heads who normally have a point of view. And that can be infuriating at times. And we hope that they know what they're talking about, but sometimes they can lead us astray. So I think we have to be very discerning as listeners, as news consumers, and try to separate out what seems to be factual, what seems to be important, and what is just filling time.
Mhm. But that idea of a 24-hour news cycle has gotten better. I mean, remember when CNN first came on the scene in the 90s? We're showing
Yes.
our age here, Dick. And to be honest, it seemed like in 24 hours, there was like an hour of news.
Yes.
It was just a lot of repetition. So we've gotten better. But certainly around elections, how is the 24-hour news cycle or this idea of one impacted reporting around elections, especially as it relates to news outlets calling races before all the votes have been counted?
Well, obviously, politics and elections are very important topics. They're great to talk about. Everybody has an opinion. You can find opinion leaders on both sides, all sides, up and down, every which way,
Mhm.
and it makes for great conversation. But you asked about calling races, and I do think that news organizations do a pretty good job of that,
Mhm.
and they don't get too far out there because the news organizations that have professional pollsters that do the research, the exit polling, they're very advanced, and I think their methodology is very sound.
Mm.
And so I do think that we need to understand that they're probably doing a very good job, but they're not infallible. Like the polling that we saw in 2016 and some of the polling that we're seeing this year could be off, but people tend to forget, oh, yes, there's a margin of error.
Mm-hmm.
We're not saying exactly what it's going to be. There can be a margin of error that comes into play. So I think the news organizations that are doing polling, that are doing projections, are very serious about it, and they do a really good job. We as consumers, though, need to understand that it's a guess. It's still a guess based on many factors. And so you might not be able to always trust everything until finally the votes are over.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I heard this week, I was on a call with an NPR political reporter and some analysts as well, all lawyers. And one of them was Justin Levitt from Loyola Marymount University School of Law. And he said, we never know the winner on election night. We have to wait until all the votes are in, and it can change.
But that's tricky because, so trying to put my news consumer hat on for a minute.
Yes.
When I'm watching the election coverage, and especially when someone comes out to concede, it looks like it's a done deal to me. It looks like it's a done deal to the average news consumer. So again, if there has to be a burden on the news consumer to be curious, to ask questions, but why does it seem so final when we're watching it on the news or when we're, certainly looking at our screens?
It's a really good question. Why do we want it to be final? I think we want to resolve it. We want to move on. We're conditioned to watch television, and at the end of an hour, you know who did it. You know who's punished for it. Now we move on to the next show.
Yeah.
And I think people tend to look at news as a show. And that's a bit of a problem because news is a continuum. When is the story finished?
Good question.
Well, the story may never be finished.
Mm-hmm.
When is the election over? Well, it's not on election night because you have to wait until all the votes are in, and you have to wait until the contests have occurred and the audits have occurred and the legal challenges have occurred. And only then do you really know who won. And that takes a few days. So we just have to be patient and realize that this is not a show that's going to have a beginning, middle, and end, and it all gets resolved in the course of 3 hours. This is not a movie. It's reality.
Mm-hmm. In
One
real
thing
reality, not a reality show.
It is. It's not a reality show. And lately, I think we've seen a lot of show and not much reality. But let me say this. I think this is important. And this was also on the call that I took this week with NPR. In the last 15 years, political scientists have identified that there is what's called a blue shift in our elections, and it's pretty much uniform across the country. And by blue shift, that means that early results tend to favor Republicans and Democratic ballots tend to come in and get counted later. And to a large extent, this is because Democrats tend to be more concentrated in urban areas, large urban areas where it takes a longer time to count the ballots. Also, Democrats tend to vote more by absentee, by mail-in voting. And depending on what the particular jurisdiction does, those may come in early and be counted early. They may be counted later. And so one thing that they did tell us is be patient on election night because the true results of the election might not be known for 2 or 3 days or longer, depending on the rules of mail-in balloting. And so one party or one candidate may say, well, I'm ahead, and now all of a sudden everything is shifting, and so there must be fraud involved. That's not necessarily true and probably is not true. It's because of what political scientists have seen as this blue shift.
Interesting. So let's talk about, since we're on politics, and how you practice transparency and media literacy at KGOU. I'm going to share my screen and just show our viewers a little bit of what you do at KGOU in something called the Manager's Minute.
This is the Manager's Minute,
Well, General Election Day is almost here, and we have an ambitious plan for election night coverage on November 3rd. Beginning at 7, you can hear NPR's national election broadcast, focusing on the presidential and congressional races on KGOU and at kgou.org. Also at 7, go to oklahomaengage.com on your mobile phone, computer, or tablet for a second screen experience featuring Oklahoma results and discussion with election and political experts. That special online program, Oklahoma Engaged Live, Voice of the Voter, will continue until 11 at oklahomaengaged.com. It's going to be quite a night, and we hope you join us. Oklahoma Engaged is made possible by major funding from the Inasmuch Foundation, with additional funding from the Kirkpatrick Foundation and Oklahoma Humanities. With the Manager's Minute, I'm Dick Pryor.
Okay, so that's an example of the Manager's Minute. And every time you talk about something different, this is talking about the election coverage and what you have coming up for November 3rd.
Right.
Talk a little bit about the Manager's Minute, why you think that's important. And I'm not sure if you started that or not, but why that's important to you.
Sure. Well, that was actually started. It was called the Manager's Desk when Karen Holt, the previous general manager, started that. And she did that following the Oklahoma City bombing and wanted to have an opportunity to speak to listeners more directly, not just during newscasts, and to assure people that things were going to be okay. And it grew from there to become a more transparent look or sound into what we do, why we do it, and to really give people who are supporters, especially, but the general public, an idea that there's more to it than what you may hear on the air. So that one that you just heard was a really promotional announcement, nicely done for next week and into the following week, with the shout out to our funders, including Oklahoma Humanities.
But that's transparency, though.
Yes, that's right. That's transparency. And many times we will talk about the students that we have, or we'll talk about our budget, or we'll talk about our fundraising. We'll talk about new programs, personnel changes, things like that. I think it's really important to make that personal connection because relationships really matter. Mm-hmm. And the Manager's Minute, previously Manager's Desk, I think is a way for us to make that personal connection with people that are listening. So you have a little bit more of an investment in what we do and you understand what's going on. We're people too, and we're doing the best we can with what we have. And we try to communicate that through the Manager's Minute.
Thank you. Thank you. So, okay, let's kind of broaden our view just a little bit, coming from Oklahoma and what you do, and just talking about media in general and the role of media. So, and these are definitely some tough questions, and I certainly would love to know what our viewers are thinking as well. Here's one. In a perfect world, what role should journalists play in a democracy?
That is a big question. You and I could talk about this one for a while, couldn't we?
You sure could.
A couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, I had the opportunity to moderate a panel discussion, an audience discussion. And what I moderated was a discussion with Carl Bernstein. I'm sure many of our listeners tonight will remember that. Maybe many were there. And as Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post says, journalists should seek the best obtainable version of truth. And I think at the bottom line, that's what we do. I think, as I mentioned earlier, we need to hold elected officials and powerful institutions accountable. We need to do stories about a diverse audience, not necessarily what the majority is doing, but what everybody is doing. Diversity, I think, is really important. And as broadcasters, we are expected, indeed, we're licensed to serve the public interest. And we're also expected to do stories about the people in our communities of service. And that means that we need to do stories about people based on geography, socioeconomic status, gender, race, religion, national origin, ability, identity, cultural influences. So we really create a view of the people that we serve and the communities that we live in. And I think that's a really underappreciated part of what we're supposed to do. And part of that includes serving, recognizing those communities that are underserved, those that traditionally are not bubbling up with a lot of stories, that traditionally may not be the news leaders, the people that are making news every day, but they're doing something in their community that everybody needs to know about. And I think the more we as storytellers tell those stories, the more we connect our communities and help build community. And bottom line, Yvette, I think we serve the public. We need to always remember that we are supposed to serve the public. Even commercial entities serve the public. We have to make enough money to survive, to pay the bills, to expand, to do all the things that everyone expects us to do. But we ultimately have to remember that we serve the public.
And can we serve the public in a role in democracy that's not just a journalist? So what I mean is, can journalists actually participate in our democratic society and still be journalists?
Sure, we have to.
Okay, so with all our opinions, all our ideas, we may support one person or another. We may believe in one cause or another because we're humans and we have our own opinions and ideas. How does that work in the role we play in democracy as journalists?
Well, it takes work. And it's interesting to me because we sometimes hear the claims of bias against media organizations, and some are biased. Some are biased because it's their business model. They're serving a particular audience or a niche. And you have to understand that. Sometimes that's just the way they're designed. But real journalism, true journalists that are trying to be fair, not necessarily balanced, because as Jim Lehrer once told me, he doesn't understand balance. He said, but I do understand fairness. And I think we have an obligation to be fair to people. But I think as journalists, we have to apply everything we've learned, all the information we've consumed, our critical thinking skills, our skills of asking questions and discerning what people are really saying, connecting dots. We have to do that because ultimately we tell stories. We are storytellers, and we have to be skeptical. We're naturally skeptical. But we also, I think, as journalists, we draw upon whatever is inside us, whoever we are, and however we've been raised, and however we've been trained, and what we've learned to serve the public. And we're driven by a desire to find the truth, tell the truth, and improve the human condition. And I will say this, I think all of that can create tension because we may see something that is wrong and we want to do that story. Someone may say, well, I don't agree with the approach you took on that story. There's lots of different ways you can tell stories. And I think what people need to remember about us, those of us that are trained, and we're really one of the few, if not the only profession trained not to be biased. We're trained not to be biased, but then we get accused of being biased. That's kind of odd to me. But we have well-defined hypocrisy and BS meters.
That's true.
And usually we don't, we don't tolerate that too well. And sometimes it bubbles up, but that's how we are able to get to the bottom of stories and find the truth. And so we do have to kind of put some of those personal feelings aside, but some of it also comes into play, which is not to say it's wrong.
We understand, we really are exposed to perhaps a lot more than the average person, depending on the job that we have in journalism and the role that we play. So we may see even more, but I think people, and you've said this, you said that citizens need to understand some things about journalists, our work, and if they do that, what do you think they need to understand that could increase their trust in the media? And I'll even say that, so I'm a board member of the Society of Professional Journalists, and there was a trust project that was performed where we went to Casper, Wyoming, which was listed as the least trusted, or the place that least trusted media. And so our one of our staff members went out there and talked to the people in that town about trust. And I think it was a really, really good experience. I think some people have actually continued to follow what we're doing, but that word trust becomes so important. So what do you think citizens need to understand about what we do that may increase their trust in the media?
I want to ask you a question first.
Mhm.
Why did they not trust?
Oh, wow. Well, there are a lot of reasons. There were a lot of assumptions. There were a lot of assumptions that the media is, the liberal media, that expression. So I think there were a lot of assumptions, and they also did not understand the day-to-day, the work. And I think in the role of ombudsman, I mean, that's certainly what I tried to do. And, how do you report? How do you write a story? Some of that, if you don't do it every day, you don't really know how that gets done. And so you may make some assumptions about how that gets done.
Right, right. I think that was the answer right there.
I answered my own question.
How do we improve the level of trust? We tell people why we do what we do, how we do it. We are more transparent, whether it's a manager's minute or something else. We're more transparent about the decision-making process. And I wish we as journalists would establish that as part of what we do, that we need to devote, just like we need to devote part of our time to management of people. We need to devote part of our time to research, to producing stories, all of those things that we have to do. I think we sometimes forget that A, we have to promote what we do, but B, we also need to explain what we do. And I think if we could do that more frequently, then people would trust us more. They would understand. People fear what they don't understand. And I think they fear us or denigrate us because they don't understand. I had a situation recently where I got a call, this week, last week, for one of the shows that I do. We interviewed the chair of the Republican Party. And I got a call from a woman that was cordial. She was nice, but she said, well, I don't think you did that right. I think I need to hear from the chair of the other party. And I said, well, listen on Friday. She said, oh, okay. Well, I hadn't thought about that. And I wanted to say, well, we do. And just because they were not back to back doesn't mean we're unfair. So we're definitely unfair. And believe me, I worked for 25 years at OETA. We covered the legislature, the people that gave us the money. That tells you how you have to be fair. You always have to know there's another part to this story. There may be multiple parts to the story, but you have to try to be as fair as possible. But fairness is not just within a 5-minute time period or 10-minute period. You may interview one person today and a competing person tomorrow, but that's all we can do. You can't always align every interview or every story as a counterpoint.
Right. And as you said, in many cases, there's no end to the story. And so there's more than two sides sometimes. And you just have to continue to do the work and continue to add to the story and not let the story drop. And I know this isn't perfect. It's not a perfect world, but the anniversary of a story, when that comes up, then the newsroom might want to take a look at it again and say, okay, how has this story changed? Where is this person now, or where is that person now, or what has happened? So again, not a perfect world, but going back and determining maybe the truth has shifted. Of course, there's difference between facts and truth. So there's some.
Yes, that is true. And I will say this, and for the people that are watching this tonight, if you have a concern about a story, if you don't think we got it right, if you think there was more to the story than what we were able to present, give us a call, send us an email. And when you do, though, give us your name and contact information, because I like to call people back and talk it through so we can have this dialogue. So I can say, well, yeah, we probably messed up on that story. And I've done that recently and offered a mea culpa. But on the other hand, we may say, yes, we couldn't talk to the person that you thought we should have talked to because they were unavailable. But we have to do the story. So we do the best we can with what we have. And so sometimes people just call to complain. Other times people really want to know, well, why did you do it that way? And I have found that most of the time, when you're able to have that conversation with our listeners, with our viewers, if you're able to explain to them why you did it this way, they'll cut you some slack. They'll understand. And it's really important, I think, to build those relationships.
It really is. And the fact that many media outlets don't have that role anymore, and it's great that you're taking that on as general manager, but many don't. The role of ombudsman has fallen to the wayside because that was probably one of the first jobs to cut when we needed to cut. But a lot of people sometimes don't have time to develop those relationships, and I would argue that that's the kind of thing that we need to make time for. So I totally am in agreement with you there. Okay, so I want to turn to the news that starts with F, but I'm not going to say it. In fact, SPJ has a disinformation. We're going to call it that, Disinformation Day. Has that charge of disinformation, because I'm not going to say the word, has it ever been thrown at your work, or certainly your media outlets where you have worked? And what is the best way for journalists to respond when people believe that they are spreading disinformation?
That charge I have actually never heard.
That's good.
I've never heard it. It's usually been a more specific claim or charge or concern about something that we did, and that's good. We would much rather be able to deal with something that's specific rather than some kind of universal get out of jail free card, which is, oh, I didn't do that because it's, well, that word, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I think the more we discuss with people and are open with people, transparent with people about what we do and how we're doing it and the demands that we face, because young journalists today, and you're training them at the Gaylord College, young journalists today, this is a great time to be a journalist, but there's also a lot of pressure. There's pressure to do a video version, an audio version, a written version, a blog. You have to do so many stories so quickly. And sometimes that means the storytelling suffers. But that's one of the demands that we're up against. So I think we have to explain to people that we can't do everything that we want to do at any particular time. And it is a dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm going to read you something, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Here's something. I'm going to use that term that you didn't want to use.
Okay.
And I don't like it either. But I think this illustrates the dilemma that we have.
Mm-hmm.
And this is by one of my favorite writers. It's Pulitzer Prize winning Washington Post columnist Eugene Robinson.
Yes.
He spoke to the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication in August 10th of 2017. And in part, Eugene Robinson said this, and I quote, "I've been thinking a lot about this fake news issue. My natural instinct is that the proper response is simply to keep doing our jobs. We report and analyze the real news, and we are conditioned to believe that ultimately the truth shall overcome. Ultimately and inevitably, truth defeats lies. That's what I've always believed, but now I have to wonder. I have to wonder whether the technology of propaganda has not outpaced and perhaps overwhelmed the technology of truth. I'm not just talking about the world according to Fox News versus the world according to MSNBC. I'm talking about a new world in which so many people are getting their news through Facebook feeds and elected officials communicate directly with their constituents via Twitter. I'm talking about a new world in which lies can appear to be validated and where access to leaders and information by the real news media is under threat. I wonder if we, in the media, might not be fighting a 21st century war using 20th century weapons and rules. It is starting to feel as if this is an asymmetrical conflict and we're on the wrong end of it. To be clear, we're not fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for the public theater we serve and for truth. We cannot have a democracy without an agreed upon chronicle of events and a common encyclopedia of facts. That is what seems to be disappearing And I think this is a crisis.
Mm, mm. There's a
So
lot there to unpack.
there is a lot there to unpack, but I read that, and whenever I do media literacy training with groups, I generally use part of that statement from Eugene Robinson to show everyone that this is a concern for journalists. We're trying to do the best we can, but it is an ever-changing environment that we operate in, and it's almost changing faster than we can keep up.
Mhm. The technology, and I embrace it, certainly my students embrace it, in a way is great because they can access news and information just any time of day. Sometimes in class, which is not where they're supposed to be at the time.
Right.
But so sometimes, I mean, that's great. But at the same time, when we're trying to move so quickly, as you said, we can lose things, we can drop things, we can focus in the wrong area, or there can be a hole in the story, the classic hole in the story, which is what I was always looking for when I was editing. Where's the hole in the story? What are we not talking about that we should be talking about? Or who are we not talking about that we should be talking about? Or a hole in our coverage. And so often we're chasing breaking news. And that is a chase that, while it's important for people to know what's going on, um, sometimes we need that deeper explanation, that interpretive journalism, explanatory journalism. And that is hard to do when you are moving so quickly and trying to make sure you have the next post.
Yes,
So
it is.
I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that technology is changing, keeping changing. And I think that if we can figure out a way to change with it, and I know that we've been trying to do that, but a lot of times that just means sound bites, or that just means little nuggets of information. If we can push the sound bites and the nuggets of information out to people, but somehow convince them to come back to the source material that's deeper and richer, that might be a better thing, but that's hard to do as well.
It is hard to do. So we have the pressures of technology changing, the expectations of our consumers who want it now and they want it good and they want it again in an hour
Mhm.
and hopefully updated, right, in a form that they want on the platform that they want. And you have all of the business considerations. And I think one of the things that we also have is that we are still operating within an ethical framework. And the rules of that are changing. I know you've spent a lot of time dealing with journalism ethics,
Mhm.
but I think that's changing too. And how do we operate ethically, fairly, credibly in a world where it's moving too fast and there's too much for us to do to really get the story out and to give the context and the perspective that the people need by
Yeah.
connecting those dots. Um, there was a really good quote recently on Twitter, ironically,
Mhm.
from David Korn of Mother Jones about this. And he was talking about something that I think is a real problem, and that is false equivalency journalism.
Mm.
And he said, so if you have a story where somebody douses gasoline in a house and throws a match, the headline should read, "Arsonists burns down home." But often the headline is, "Fire breaks out."
Mhm.
I think we've got to figure out a way to be honest. And it's tough because we, again, try to do our work within the guardrails of ethics. And we don't want to be unfair to anybody. So we kind of water it down and probably are not doing the best job of storytelling that we could when we're in that situation.
So much is on our minds these days. We're even thinking about the words that we use, not because they're the best words, or not because they're the words that are going to tell the story more accurately and fully to our reader, but what's going to get us best SEO.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And those are things that the average reporter is being asked to think about, because the average reporter, as you said, they're writing the story, but they're also providing some kind of images, and many times they're writing the headline and pushing it straight to social media or pushing it straight to media. Someone can go back in there and finesse that, but again, these are things that I think people are asked to think about now that certainly we did not before.
Yes.
And so,
Yes.
I mean, everything keeps changing. So is TikTok, is it coming or going? Now Instagram has Reels that's kind of like a TikTok type thing. And so now should we be on Reels? And of course, there's a lot of entertainment in this area. TikTok and Instagram Reels are very entertaining videos. I was taught that we should do several things, that we should inform and also entertain the reader.
Mm-hmm.
Should we entertain the reader? Should we be on every platform that we can be on? I don't know how you would entertain on TikTok or Instagram Reels with a story about a fire. That probably wouldn't be appropriate. But if there is a human interest story or something like that, should we be in those areas?
Yes. And we should.
Yeah.
Should. But doesn't it all come down though to capacity and priorities?
Oh yeah.
And I think people don't quite understand that sometimes, that we have to make some tough calls. Yeah, that's a great story. I'd love to tell that story. I don't have the time. I don't have the resources. I don't have the staff for that story.
Right.
It's just kind of the way it is.
But there are some publications and outlets that have created, for example, the Cannabis Reporter, because that's big news now. So if you can create the Cannabis Reporter, should you have a TikTok reporter, or should you have an Instagram Reel reporter? I mean, that's different. I know that's a subject matter versus a platform, but we do, and we create what we think is important. So I think we just have to decide what we think is going to get us to the next step. And I don't know if providing videos on those platforms would help in the trust area or not, but it might be a way certainly to get yet one more platform of where you can find news and information.
Yes. In the TV realm, years and years ago, in talking to a news director, yeah, that's a great story, but what's the video for that story? Well, I don't really have it. Well, then you're not doing that story. Maybe one of the better stories you've run across, but if you don't have the resources that you need, the assets that you need, that story's not going to see the light of day. But I think, to your point, I think there is an opportunity now, and we're seeing this with smaller news operations that are serving a particular need. And I think it's good. It's good because we, those of us in traditional legacy media, we can't do everything. We can't be everywhere. But somebody, I think, does, and we're starting to see that.
So I know we want to save time for comments or questions, but I want to ask you one more question.
Sure.
I know it's a question that you are often asked. So we're moving away from platforms to subject matter.
Yeah.
Why does every news channel cover the same stories? Aren't there other stories to cover?
Sure. Yeah, but there's not that many stories that anybody will read, watch, or listen to, are there? Are there really that many? Because if you think about it, we're all trained in journalism schools. We learn similar values, ways to evaluate a story, ways to tell a story. We also learn over time what sells. To your point about entertainment, one of those news directors told me, yeah, that may be a great story, but if it's not catchy, if it's not a story that grabs somebody, they won't pay attention to it. And what did you just do? Right? Nobody's paying attention. You're not going to survive very long. But reporters and producers, I think, have an intuitive sense about which stories are good, which stories are doable, which ones are a waste of time and resources. And the other thing is that I think we're very competitive, and nobody wants to miss a story. So there's a certain mentality, a herd mentality, where we follow each other. Go into any television newsroom and you're going to see somewhere, there's going to be 3, 4, 5, 6 TV screens on the wall where you're watching what everybody else is doing.
That's true.
And if somebody is out there doing that story, I guarantee you in about 15 minutes, the assignment desk is going to say, hey, you need to get out there and get on that story.
Or why don't we have that story?
Yeah. And that's what you don't want to hear, right?
Yeah, that's right.
You don't want to hear the news director or the managing editor says, why don't we have that story? Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
So there is a certain mentality to it all. And the other part of it too kind of makes sense is if you see a certain story on one channel and another channel doesn't have it, there is some kind of a sense, I think, that comes into play that, well, maybe they just don't know what's going on. The ones that didn't go do that story.
Right.
And so that's why you have to be there. Real quick story, very quick, because I know we have other questions to ask if we have time remaining. Remember the Branch Davidian story in Waco years ago? Stations from Texas and Oklahoma and some other surrounding states sent reporters there, and they thought it was going to be over in a couple of 3 days. Well, it wasn't. It was weeks. And stations drained their budgets because they felt like they had to cover that story. Well, nobody wanted to pull their reporters off that story to their own detriment because they ran out of money covering this story, and they couldn't do other stories because they were spending so much money on that story, but they were committed to it, and they didn't want to be the first one to pull out. And so again, that's kind of that herd mentality.
Yeah. Speaking of herd mentality, I've often said that if we had an animal story on the front page or the home page every day, more people would read it.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think anyone ever agreed with me, but I really pushed for that for a while. Like, we need to have a dog or cat on the front page every single day.
Yeah. Well, why not? Let's try that and see what happens.
Yeah, right? Okay, well, I know we have a question or two. AC, do you want us to? Hi.
Yeah, hi, I'm here. There is a question in the chat. The question is, how can we maintain connection with family members who are sending us news, in quotes, that we don't agree with?
Well, if you don't agree with it, it would be real easy to say, just ignore it. On the other hand, there might be something to it. And this gets into that discerning news consumer discussion. I think it's incumbent on anybody in that situation to look at it and try to figure out, is there any truth to this? Is there a reason I need to know about this? Maybe they're right. Maybe they know something. Or maybe they're just passing stuff along that is just completely made up. So I would say, don't just automatically accept it or rule it out, but maybe ask a few questions. And this is really running with scissors stuff. You might even ask them to explain it to you and have a conversation about it.
You don't want to be that person that always says, I know more than you. You know, I'm a journalist, I know more than you. And I have been that person from time to time. I am that friend on Facebook that will correct you if you post a story that is 5 years old. I am that person. But I've even made that mistake myself one time. We're human, right? I would say that I would ask them, oh, where did you see that? I didn't see that. I mean, because probably that's true. Maybe I didn't see that. And usually they don't know, or they just think they heard something. And I encourage them, well, show me. Can you show me where that was? And really try to help them do a little research on their own while they're trying to help me. And sometimes we'll have a conversation. Of course, this might not be good over the dinner table, over the Thanksgiving dinner table, or whatever that's about to come up. And I understand that can be very difficult, but I think you're right, Dick. Not just discounting it right off, even if you know it to be untrue, even if you know that to be disinformation. But maybe just having a conversation and asking them, well, where did they hear that? And oh, I didn't hear that. What did it say? And maybe just try to go down a little path with them. And maybe by the end, they'll realize it wasn't a credible source, or you can show them it wasn't a credible source. There was no fact checking involved. But if you just say that to someone, well, that wasn't credible, I mean, they're just not going to have a positive reaction to that.
You're absolutely right. And one of my favorite questions is, how do you know that? How do you know that? I'd like to know more about this. So help me. And
Yeah,
mean it. And mean it. I mean, the thing is, sincerity is important in that conversation,
right.
as opposed to, I think that's nuts, and I can't believe you would say that or post that. Well, how do you know that? I'd like to learn more. And it's just what you said. I think that's the best way to do it. One thing I will suggest, and I've done this with a class at Gaylord, and that is to say, here's something for you to try. You don't have to do it just because I'm saying it, but try this. At Thanksgiving, when you go home for Thanksgiving, you're sitting around the table with your family and friends, talk about religion and politics. And of course, everybody kind of looks at me like, oh my God, I can't do that. And I said, exactly. You don't know how to do it.
Mhm.
We have to practice it. You can't do anything well unless you practice it. So I think that's another thing, Yvette, that consumers need to, all of us need to learn, is how to have those kinds of conversations about difficult topics. Because the more we practice that and the more we're respectful and listen, please listen, not just talk,
Mhm.
the more we have a chance to understand.
Gaylord had a really great dream course a couple of semesters ago called the Listening Project.
Yeah.
And listening is so difficult. And while I agree with what you just said, that I know that that'd be so difficult to do at family get-togethers, holidays, when you really don't see, you might see somebody you haven't seen in a long time,
Mm-hmm.
and that person starts spouting something. It's hard. It's really hard because you just want to have a good time and eat your pie.
Right.
So it's difficult.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
But hopefully that kind of an approach might lead to something and really a greater bond and a greater relationship over time.
Hmm. I think students have a really good opportunity because they can blame it on the professor and they can say, "Well, I have this assignment I have to do, and it's talking to you about this."
Yeah.
I say try it.
What do you have to lose?
Exactly.
And we have a kind of related question, I think, in the chat as well that I think pushes this conversation a little bit beyond, which is like, how do we converse responsibly with folks who are engaging in dangerous conspiracy theories like QAnon? And how do we talk about media literacy in the face of, conspiracy theories?
I think that's tougher. I would say probably run. Um, I don't know. There's a whole lot of pathology involved in how people come to believe in conspiracies,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't understand it. We all have certain things that we want to know and believe in. And all I can really say about that is that I think once people assign a belief to themselves and it becomes part of their identity and their values, it's really hard to move them, even if it's based in something that's complete nonsense. Um, and I think that does go to what you were talking about. At some point, when if you do have that conversation with someone that believes a certain way that you just can't really wrap your head around, at some point you have to know when to say, we're done. You can't go there. Because I think if people really feel so strongly about certain things and they're just convinced that this is what has happened, or this is what their tribe believes and your tribe's wrong, you can do a little bit of work there, but at some point you might just have to move on.
Mm-hmm. For me, it's coming back to the source. And if I simply cannot believe that the source is credible, then I have to tell that person that and say that they have to give me more information, that I don't believe that because I know the source to be, not credible. I know the source, it does not fact check. I know the source, doesn't do the level of things that I need to be able to believe in a story. So maybe saying it that way, I'm not saying you're crazy, but this source you got it from, I simply don't believe them.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen some psychological research that indicates that people, when you do provide the facts,
Mhm.
ironically, when you do provide the facts, there are certain beliefs, if they are so firmly held and you can't move them, that even if you give them alternate reality here, that what you're saying is just not based in reality, and here's what's really going on, and here are the facts. They have a tendency to actually dig in more.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of goes to that deal that we've faced, being that person who says, oh no, that story's not right, here's the real story and I know it. Yeah.
Right.
And you'll get pushback.
That's
Yeah.
right.
I think, and I'll just chime in here, I'm not a journalist, but I do work in communications and communications across lines of difficulty and in difficult conversations, pushing the needle with folks. And one of the questions that I often like to ask is, what would that mean? If that was true, what would that mean? And really trying to dig in and find those values conversations, right? Where is it a motivation of fear? Is it a sense of isolation or longing or, mistrust, feeling alone or against the world, right? What is going on beyond, just this surface level story that this person is pushing in conversation? And where can you get into alignment with them to kind of bring them back around? And say, that's not what I've heard and that's not what I know to be true, but I can hear that this is happening. And I want to make sure that we're finding ways for us to connect, or we're finding ways to have a conversation about the fear that you feel. And those are, I think, the ways that I work in those communication spaces and try to then circle back around to those. Okay, now what's the source? Now that you and I are in value alignment, right? We see eye to eye on at least a little piece of something. Where can we start to have the conversation about those details? So
that is excellent. That's an excellent point. Yes. Don't always default to leading with the disagreement. Lead with the common ground.
Yeah.
Nice.
That brings us kind of to the end of our time this evening. Thank you so much, Yvette and Dick, for joining us. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us for our last installment of Citizen 2020. And I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you taking time. It's been fun.